Hi, Elizabeth. It's your turn. Thanks for your questions. So, Elizabeth, you had four questions. So, let's see if I can tackle these. Your first question was, how have you been able to separate your intended career from the one you have currently? Meaning the skills you took from your original career, have they affected your performance as an educator? So, I think that you're asking about um, my career as a social worker. So, I'm not really sure exactly how to answer this, except that mm, when my preparation to be a social worker was really active listening and understanding group dynamics and family dynamics um, and sort of the healing process and trauma. So those skills are a skill of relating to human beings and becoming a teacher is more about relating to human beings than it is a subject area. It's more than grammar. It's more than literature. It's more than um, writing a 5 paragraph essay. It's about relating to human beings, and that's first and foremost. And I really think that work as a social worker has made me the teacher that I am, which some people like and some people don't like. And I think it's made me the kind of teacher that puts human beings and stories first, and writing as a way of understanding who we are and our place in the world and how we can impact the world, and reading so that we can understand our place in the world and how the world impacts us. And I think all of that comes from how human beings relate, how human beings communicate, what human beings need. And so I think that that's intertwined. So I don't think it's about separating. I don't know if that's what you meant. Okay. Your second question was the bubble kids, which I thankfully have not heard since my first few years of teaching. But how do I approach the bubble kids without having the mindset that they were not succeeding as well as other kids? So I think there is a sense that as a teacher, you know who's struggling, whether you see their test scores or not. You have a sense of students who always have had this identity as being the student who's behind, or the student who gets in trouble, or the student who doesn't get good grades. The students come to you in junior high and high school with an identity tied up in those sort of descriptors about themselves, even if no one ever says it to them. And I think, again, being mindful of the fact that this this kid or that kid has that reputation as part of who they think that they are. And so, again, writing and reading are ways for dismantling that and troubling their self concept, and giving them other ways to show that they can be successful and that they're important and that they have authority. And that's why giving them choice in what they read, and choice in what they write, and choice in what they talk about, and choice in how they're graded, and options in how to approach different things, so there isn't just one way of doing things. I think all of those acknowledge the human being and their agency, and helps them kind of unpack being like pigeonholed into being the bubble kid or the struggling kid or the troublemaker or the class clown or something like that. So your third question was, was it easy to bring up these certain instances related to genocide, or was it more difficult to talk about this within your classroom? Were some of the articles a little bit more advanced for students to understand? Yes, I think the language of genocide, the language of social justice issues is elusive to students, and I think our job is to kind of unpack it with the students. So I think I like to start. I like to start with a big question or a big idea, and then unpack it instead of teaching parts to help students get to the whole. I don't know if that makes sense. So for introducing genocide, it was the access point into that was just basic human rights, and talking about what we have the right to as human beings, and what it means to be a human being. And so access into that um, at the beginning of the lesson was one of the ways that we can talk about genocide, not as something that happened, but as something that's sort of ongoing and has like long-term implications. Especially some of the students were learning about Native American, sort of the Indian Removal Act in history class, thinking that there aren't any more Native Americans out there, or that the fact that they lost their land still has sort of like historic trauma on Native American peoples today. And so one of the ways of talking about it is talking about Columbus Day versus Indigenous Peoples Day, versus having conversations about cultural appropriation of Halloween costumes. So I'm not necessarily teaching genocide, but these are ways of illuminating how there isn't really a beginning and an end to that concept. So it's more important that students understand the cultural oppression than it is that they can identify like stages of genocide or recount details or facts of what happened, because it's still historic and it's situated in human beings. And then, trauma, there's also this great fascinating research about epigenetics and how trauma is passed through your DNA. So a family member who survived Holocaust, for example, their offspring has some of the DNA of their trauma being passed. I don't know very much about it, but it's fascinating. And your last question was about story sharing, and if a student feels uncomfortable when you tell them to share. Some stories or topic can be slightly more difficult for students to approach publicly rather than a more private setting. So we do lots of writing in our notebook that I never take from the students. I never read their notebooks. I never take their notebooks. I never grade their notebooks. It's their property, their stories and their ideas. It's theirs. So we write a lot. We write every single day in that on a variety of topics, and students are always writing in there. When we have story time on Fridays, we have open mic every Friday. The students choose what they want to share. And when we have in process papers or papers that we're going to publish on our blog or something like that, the students know from the beginning that that's something that is going to be shared publicly, and having consent. I think you might have had another question about consent, or someone might have had a question about consent before sharing the story. Yeah, that was you, Janet. So when it comes time to publishing something on our blog that they wrote, whether it's a poem or a biography or a personal narrative or something like that, the students know upfront that we're going to be producing something that's going to go through peer review, that's going to be published. So they choose whether or not they want to write about a certain topic, or if they want to not include certain parts to it. So some students have written up like a couple versions of something, one that they shared publicly, another one that they didn't include certain parts that they didn't want. So it's always up to them to decide. But when we are going to publish something, I make it very clear that this has to be a topic that they're comfortable sharing, that they're ready to share, and that makes a really big difference in it too. All right, so thank you for your questions, Elizabeth.